Every videographer wants to get nice cinematic shots to make their film stand out. It is actually easily achievable, provided you know what to do. Keep watching to find out my tips on how to enhance your shots. Hey guys, what's up? My name is Bernard and welcome to the channel. So today's video is essentially a compilation of all the mistakes and lessons I've learned over my journey as a videographer. If you're new to this channel, do consider subscribing for more of such content in the future. The beauty of the tips I'm about to share today is that they are so simple, yet they can make any videographer that is just starting out look like an advanced filmmaker. To kickstart this thing, I'm going to start with my favorite tip, which is to use foreground in your shots. Firstly, adding foreground in your shot gives the image more depth. Without it, it will look very two-dimensional. Secondly, adding foreground will accentuate the camera movement and make the shot more dynamic. I am now doing the exact same camera movement but without the foreground. The shot looks like it's barely moving. Adding foreground into your shot is such a simple thing to do, yet it's a total game changer. The next tip I have is something I picked up from a YouTuber called Mark Bone, and it is to shoot with your subject backlit, especially for B-roll and when you're using natural lighting outdoors. I know it sounds very counterintuitive because when I first started out, I thought that it would be best if my subject features were lit properly. However, over time, I realized that by shooting my subject backlit, it makes the scene more dramatic. When you shoot with your subject facing the sun, not only does the subject look very flat, they would also probably be squinting or looking uncomfortable because the sun is in their face. In proper terms, shooting backlit emphasizes the depth behind the subject and gives the image a greater sense of place. I googled this. If you think that shooting directly into the sun sacrifices too much details, you can position the sun 45 degrees to the left or right of your subject. That way, you will still get the effects of backlighting, but you'll still be able to see details in your shadows and your highlights are not blown out. You will be able to identify this by ensuring that their shadow is pointed towards the side, not directly at you. The third tip is another one I picked up from Mark Bone. If it's not obvious already, after this video, you should totally check out his channel. Anyways, the tip is to shoot into the shadow side of a person's face, and this is especially relevant when you're shooting A-roll. The purpose of this is to give more depth to the shot and it makes it look much more cinematic. Ever since I found out about this tip, I started noticing that all major productions follow this rule about 90% of the time. Do try to take note of this the next time you're watching a movie. And building on this advice, tip number 4 is for you to simulate how light will cast a shadow on a face. Instead of asking your talent to shift here and there to see how it will look, all you need to do is to form a face in your hand and look around for how you want the light to fall on your subject. Tip number 5 is a Bernard original, which is to have a default direction for all my camera movements. What I mean by this is that if I did not plan my shots in pre-production, I would move my camera in a default direction, which is from left to right whenever possible. The reason for that is if I were to cut to my next shot, if the camera movement is in the same direction, the flow will be smoother. If I were to film inconsistently and shoot from the right to left instead for my second shot, the flow will be disrupted. You might be able to fix it in post with a horizontal flip, but I try to avoid that because it doesn't always work. Tip number 6 is something probably all professional filmmakers would tell you: shoot in manual focus. As someone who started with Sony cameras, you can imagine how reliant I was on autofocus. These days, I still use autofocus, but usually only when I'm on the gimbal or when I have to do tracking shots. I switched to using manual focus 70% of the time now, especially when I'm pulling focus. I find the look more organic and I prefer it. I used to rely on the tap to focus feature, but with autofocus, I personally think that it looks a little too digital no matter what settings I use. Also, in a busier scene or certain lighting conditions, autofocus will struggle, and that's when manual focus will be a lifesaver. For me, my recommendation is not to entirely give up on autofocus. Instead, I would advise you to start getting comfortable with manual focus as early as possible. Tip number 7. Don't use auto exposure. By using auto exposure, you're entrusting the camera to decide what is the subject to expose for, and in high contrast situations, I find this to be quite unreliable. I absolutely can't stand it when an exposure changes mid-shot because it can get very distracting. Because of that, I prefer to rely on manual exposure to prevent such problems. Last but not least, my final tip is for you to start getting into the habit of using manual white balance. When I first started out, I was heavily reliant on auto white balance. Although the camera's AI is decent enough to make good decisions these days, it can get quite distracting when the auto white balance settings screw up one day. My recommendation is to start getting into the habit of changing your white balance manually whenever the scene changes. If you're unsure of what is the right settings to use, the best bet is to use a white card. From there, you can start remembering what white balance to use for each situation, and soon enough, it will become second nature. That pretty much wraps up my list of things I wish I knew when I first started filming. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you did. You can also consider buying me a cup of coffee, as it really helps me in creating more of such content in the future. That's pretty much it for this video. It's a wrap!